They say betrayal never comes from your enemies, but no one warns you it might come from the two people you trust the most. If someone had told me a year ago that my husband and my mother would be the ones to shatter my life, I would have laughed. My mom, Diane, was my best friend, my rock, especially after my dad passed away. My husband, Daniel, was my safe harbor, the man who made me believe in soulmates. For years, everything felt perfect. Daniel and I were the couple everyone envied, happy, successful, deeply in love. When Diane's second marriage ended 2 years ago, Daniel had even suggested she move in with us to recover. "She needs you right now," he'd said, his voice full of compassion. Back then, I saw it as another sign of how wonderful he was. But in hindsight, that's when everything started to shift. The first time I felt uneasy, it was over something so small it almost didn't register. I came home late from work one evening, expecting to find Daniel on the couch scrolling his phone. Instead, I found him and Diane in the kitchen, leaning close over her phone, laughing at something I wasn't part of. "What's so funny?" asked as I dropped my bag by the door. They jumped, startled, and Daniel straightened like a kid caught sneaking candy. "Just a meme," he said quickly, flashing me a nervous smile. "Daniel's teaching me about internet humor," Diane added, her tone light, but her expression was a little too guarded. It was nothing, or at least that's what I told myself. But that night, as I lay in bed next to Daniel, my mind kept circling back to that moment. Something about the way they'd been standing, their heads bent so close together, nagged at me. As the weeks passed, I started noticing more little things that didn't sit right. Daniel, who had always been so attentive, seemed distracted. He was glued to his phone, smiling at messages he wouldn't share, and he began coming home late more often. Diane, once warm and open with me, had become strangely private. She took calls in her room with the door closed and disappeared from the house for hours without explanation. One evening, we were sitting at dinner when Daniel complimented Diane's cooking. "This lasagna is incredible," he said, his tone almost admiring. "Jess, you've got competition." I forced a laugh, but it stung. Diane chuckled, brushing him off with a coy, "Oh, stop it, Daniel. You'll make her jealous." Jealous? Of my mother? The thought was ridiculous, until it wasn't. The real turning point came late one night. I couldn't sleep, so I got up to get a glass of water. As I padded down the hall, I heard voices coming from the living room. I stopped in my tracks. "We need to be careful," my mom's voice whispered, low and urgent. "I know," Daniel replied, his tone equally tense. "But it's hard when she's always around." My heart dropped. I stayed frozen, straining to hear more, but their conversation shifted to something mundane, a TV show they both liked. Still, the words hung in the air long after I retreated to my room. The next morning, they acted as if nothing had happened. Diane greeted me with her usual sunny smile, and Daniel kissed me on the cheek like he always did. But I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. From that point on, I couldn't unsee it. The way Daniel's laughter came easier around Diane than it did with me. The way her hand lingered on his arm during casual touches. It wasn't overt, but there was an intimacy between them that made my skin crawl. One Sunday afternoon, we were sitting in the backyard. Daniel was grilling, and Diane lounged in a chair, sipping iced tea. I glanced up from my book just in time to see her reach over and brush something off his shoulder, a small, insignificant gesture. But the look they exchanged in that moment wasn't insignificant at all. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept soundly beside me. The doubts swirling in my mind were relentless, each one louder than the last. Am I imagining this? Am I paranoid? Or is something really happening between them? I didn't know what to believe anymore. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that the life I thought I had was slipping away. I didn't want to believe my suspicions. Who would? The idea that my husband and my mother could betray me felt too surreal, like something out of a bad soap opera. But the harder I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, the more glaring the signs became. It wasn't just the stolen glances or the moments they spent alone. It was the way Daniel had started pulling away from me. We'd always been close, sharing everything from stupid inside jokes to our dreams for the future. But lately, it was as if he couldn't stand to be near me. It started with the excuses. Hey, let's do something this weekend, I said one Friday evening as we cleared the dinner table. We could go hiking or check out that new Italian place downtown. Daniel didn't even look up from his phone.
Can't.
I've got a lot of work to catch up on. That was becoming his go-to response.
Work.
Meetings.
Deadlines.
Yet somehow, he always managed to find time to hang out with Diane. One Saturday, I suggested a day trip to the beach. It's been ages since we had a day to ourselves, I said, trying to sound upbeat. Daniel hesitated, his gaze flicking toward Diane, who was sitting on the couch. Maybe another time, he said finally. I promised your mom I'd help her fix the fence today. The fence.
Right.
Diane wasn't any better. She'd become a master of deflection. Hey, Mom, I said one morning as she poured herself coffee. You've been going out a lot lately. Where do you go? She didn't even blink. Just running errands, sweetie. You know how it is, grocery store, pharmacy. Boring stuff. Her tone was casual, but I caught the slight tension in her shoulders as she turned away. One night, I got bold. You and Daniel seem to be spending a lot of time together, I said, trying to sound casual. Diane's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. Well, he's been a sweetheart helping me adjust. I'd be lost without him. Something about the way she said it made my stomach churn. I knew I couldn't confront them without proof. If I was wrong, I'd be the one destroying our family. But if I was right, I didn't even want to think about what that meant. Lisa, my best friend since college, was the only person I trusted to talk to. I called her one evening, barely holding it together as I explained everything I'd noticed. Oh, Jess, she said, her voice full of concern. That's wow. Are you sure, though? I mean, maybe it's just your mom being clingy and Daniel trying to help. I thought about that, I admitted, pacing the kitchen. But it's more than that, Lisa. The way they act around each other. It's like they have the secret, and I'm the idiot in the room who doesn't see it. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, here's what you do.
Don't accuse them yet.
If something's going on, you need proof. Solid proof. I sighed. And how am I supposed to get that?
Start small, she said.
Keep your eyes open.
Check his phone if you can.
Maybe even set up a camera. I hated the idea of snooping. It felt wrong, invasive. But the thought of being blindsided again was worse. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, Daniel left his phone on the coffee table while he went to shower. Normally, I would have ignored it, but the temptation was too strong. I unlocked it, his passcode hadn't changed, and scrolled through his messages. Most of them were work-related, but then I found a thread with Diane. The word needed jumped out at me. I could almost hear her voice saying it, soft and full of meaning. I locked the phone and shoved it back on the table just as Daniel walked back into the room. Everything okay? He asked, rubbing a towel through his hair. Fine, I said, forcing a smile. Just checking an email. By this point, I was running on adrenaline. I felt like a private detective, constantly watching, waiting for more evidence to fall into place. I started coming home at random times, hoping to catch them off guard. But they were always careful, always one step ahead. That's when I decided to take Lisa's advice and plant a voice recorder in the living room. It felt like something out of a bad crime drama, but I needed answers. The next day, I set it up while they were out. I tucked it behind a stack of books on the shelf, turned it on, and prayed it would give me the clarity I desperately needed. Listening to the recording that night was like stepping into a nightmare. At first, there was nothing incriminating, just the hum of the TV and the occasional clink of coffee mugs. But then I heard their voices. We shouldn't keep doing this, Diane said softly. Daniel sighed. I know, but it's hard. There was a long pause before Diane spoke again. Do you regret it? No, Daniel replied. Not for a second. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the recorder. I wanted to stop listening to smash the thing to pieces, but I couldn't. I needed to hear everything. We just have to be careful, Diane said. She can't know.
She. Me.
By the time the recording ended, I was shaking with rage and heartbreak. It was real. My mother and my husband were having an affair. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. I needed to see it for myself. Knowing the truth didn't make it easier to accept. It made it worse. Every glance, every word, every touch between Daniel and Diane now felt like proof of their betrayal. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions at work while my thoughts spiraled. At night, I replayed the recording over and over, as if hearing their voices again might make it hurt less. But it didn't. I told Lisa everything. "Oh my God, Jess," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I can't believe this. I can't wrap my head around it. Your mom?
What kind of person does that?
I don't know," I said, staring at the mug of coffee in front of me. My hands were trembling so much I hadn't even taken a sip. But I need more. I need them to admit it to my face. Lisa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you need to do, I'm here. But please be careful. You're playing with fire." She was right.
I was.
But I didn't care. That weekend, I came up with a plan. I took Monday off without telling anyone. Early that morning, I set up a small hidden camera in the living room, just above the fireplace. It had a motion sensor and would start recording as soon as someone walked into the room. Then, I pretended to leave for work. I kissed Daniel goodbye, waved to Diane in the kitchen, and walked out the front door. But instead of driving to the office, I parked my car 2 blocks away and waited. It was the longest morning of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they went numb. My stomach twisted with nerves, but I couldn't back out now. I had to know. I returned to the house around noon, stepping inside as quietly as possible. The house was silent, but I didn't take any chances. I crept up the stairs, retrieved the camera, and took it to my bedroom. My heart pounded as I watched the footage. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then, Daniel walked into the living room. Moments later, Diane joined him. They sat close on the couch, talking softly. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. Diane leaned in, resting her hand on Daniel's thigh. He didn't pull away. I froze as she kissed him. It wasn't a quick peck or a hesitant mistake. It was deliberate, intimate. And he kissed her back. My breath caught in my throat as I watched their hands wander, their bodies pressing closer. I couldn't look away, even as tears blurred my vision. I confronted them that night. I waited until we were all in the living room. Diane with her wine, Daniel scrolling through his phone, me sitting stiffly in the armchair. "I know," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the silence. Diane froze, her glass halfway to her lips. Daniel looked up, frowning. "Know what?" I stood, pulling the camera out of my bag and holding it up. "About you two. About this." Diane's face turned pale. Daniel shot to his feet, his eyes wide with panic. "Jess, let me explain," he started, stepping toward me. I held up a hand to stop him.
Don't.
"I've heard enough. I've seen enough." Diane set her glass down slowly, as if trying to regain her composure. "Sweetie, it's not what you think." "Don't call me that," I snapped, my voice cracking. "You're my mother, Diane. My husband. How could you?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking desperate. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean—" "Oh, save it," I interrupted. "You didn't mean to sleep with my mom? That's your excuse?" Diane stood, her expression hardening. "Jessica, listen to me. You've been so busy with work, so distant. Are you serious right now?" I screamed. "You're blaming me? For this?" The argument spiraled into chaos. Diane tried to play the victim, claiming she'd been lonely after her divorce and that Daniel had been there for her in ways I wasn't. Daniel, for his part, mumbled excuses about feeling unappreciated. Every word out of their mouths felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. "I trusted you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Both of you. And this is how you repay me." Neither of them answered. I walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in that house another second. As I drove aimlessly through the dark, I thought about everything I'd lost. my marriage,
My family.
my sense of safety. But as the hours passed, another thought took hold. I hadn't lost everything. I still had my dignity, and I wasn't going to let them take that away, too. The days after I left were a blur of anger, disbelief, and overwhelming sadness. I crashed at Lisa's apartment, barely able to string together coherent sentences as I recounted what had happened. She offered comfort the best she could, but I was too far gone, stuck replaying every lie and betrayal in my mind. Diane called me the first night, her name lighting up my phone like an alarm I couldn't turn off. I ignored it. She called again and then again. By the fifth missed call, she switched to text messages. Jessica, please, we need to talk. I know you're hurt, but you don't understand the full story. I love you. You're my daughter. Please don't shut me out. I deleted every one of them. Daniel wasn't any better. He emailed me an email, for God's sake. Like a professional apology was going to fix what he'd done. Jess, I can't express how sorry I am. I know I've hurt you, but I never stopped loving you. Please, let's talk. I want to explain everything. Explain everything? As if there was anything he could say that would make sleeping with my mother less horrifying. I wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. 2 weeks later, I went back to the house. I hadn't told them I was coming. It wasn't a visit. I just wanted to grab the rest of my things and leave. I didn't want to give either of them the satisfaction of seeing how broken I felt. When I walked through the door, I was greeted by the too familiar scent of Diane's lavender candles. The house was eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I went upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Daniel and started packing my clothes. My hands trembled as I shoved sweaters and jeans into a suitcase, my mind racing with every memory tied to this house. The first time Daniel and I painted the walls together. The nights we stayed up talking about our future. The mornings when I'd come downstairs to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and laughing with my husband. By the time I was halfway through, the tears came, hot and unstoppable. Jessica. The sound of her voice made me freeze. I turned to see Diane standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of guilt and determination. She looked older than I remembered, her usual confidence dulled by worry.
We need to talk, she said.
No, we don't, I replied coldly, turning back to my suitcase. Diane stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. You can't just walk away from this. From me. I'm your mother. You're a traitor, I snapped, spinning to face her. You slept with my husband, Mom. What part of that do you think I want to talk about? She flinched but didn't back down. It wasn't supposed to happen. I laughed bitterly. Oh, really? Did you trip and fall into his bed? Spare me the cliches, Diane. She sighed, rubbing her temples. I know what I did was unforgivable. But you've been so distant, Jessica. Always working, always focused on everything except your marriage. Daniel, he was lonely. Don't you dare blame this on me, I said, my voice rising. You're my mother. You were supposed to protect me, not destroy my life. I wasn't trying to destroy anything, she said, her tone defensive. I don't know. I was lonely too. I've been through so much, Jess. And Daniel, he understood me. He was there for me when I needed someone. Because that's his job, I snapped. As my husband, not yours. Before Diane could respond, the door opened and Daniel stepped in. His face lit with surprise when he saw me. Jess, you're here? Yeah, I said, glaring at him. I'm here. And I'm leaving. For good. Wait, he said, holding up a hand. Can we talk? I think you've said enough, I replied, my voice trembling with anger. Both of you? Daniel stepped closer, his expression desperate. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. But I love you, Jess. I love us. I stared at him, incredulous. You love me? That's rich, coming from the man who destroyed our marriage. Who destroyed me? I was stupid, he said, his voice cracking. It didn't mean anything. I wasn't thinking straight. Stop, I interrupted, my chest heaving. Just stop. I heard everything, Daniel. I saw everything. Don't stand there and try to lie to me. Diane stepped forward, her voice soft. Jess, please. We didn't want to hurt you. I turned to her, my fury boiling over. You didn't want to hurt me? Are you even hearing yourself? You're my mother. You knew how much he meant to me, and you still. My voice broke, and I wiped at my face angrily. You both disgust me. The confrontation ended with me walking out of the house, leaving them standing there together.
They didn't try to stop me this time.
I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the house where my life had fallen apart. I wasn't sure if I'd ever come back. The fallout was worse than I could have imagined. After I left the house for good, I thought the hardest part would be letting go of Daniel and Diane. But the truth was, their betrayal had ripple effects that tore through every part of my life. It wasn't just the loss of my husband or the destruction of my relationship with my mother. It was the humiliation, the whispers behind my back, the awkward silences from people who didn't know what to say. And worst of all, the nagging voice in my head that kept asking if I'd missed the warning signs, if this was somehow my fault. I filed for divorce a week after the confrontation. Daniel didn't fight it. In fact, he barely reacted at all when I handed him the papers. I understand, he said, his voice quiet. I wanted him to yell, to argue, to beg me to reconsider. I wanted to see some kind of remorse, something to make me believe he'd ever really loved me. But all I got was a hollow, defeated man who didn't seem to care that he'd ruined everything. Diane moved out of the house the same week, but not far enough for my liking. She rented an apartment across town, close enough to keep her tangled web of excuses and manipulations within reach. To my horror, Daniel and Diane didn't stop seeing each other. If anything, they became bolder. The first time I saw them together was at the grocery store. They were walking down the aisle, talking and laughing like nothing had happened. Diane had her hand on Daniel's arm, the same way she used to with my dad when I was a kid. I froze. They hadn't seen me yet, and I debated turning and running out of the store. But something inside me refused to back down. When Diane spotted me, her smile faltered. Daniel turned, his face going pale when our eyes met. Jessica, Diane said, her voice laced with awkward cheer. What a surprise. I stared at them, my heart pounding in my chest. A surprise? Really? You didn't think you'd run into me when you're parading around like this? Daniel looked down, unable to meet my eyes. Diane, on the other hand, didn't back down. We're not parading, she said firmly. We're just spending time together. I let out a bitter laugh. Spending time together? Is that what we're calling it now? People were starting to stare, their carts slowing as they passed us. I didn't care. I don't know how you can live with yourselves, I said, my voice shaking. Both of you. You've destroyed everything, and now you're acting like it's normal. Jess, please, Daniel murmured. Don't Jess, please me, I snapped. You're pathetic. Both of you. I left my cart right there in the aisle and walked out. The humiliation burned, but it was nothing compared to the rage. The gossip spread quickly after that. Small towns love a scandal, and mine was a goldmine. Everywhere I went, I felt the stares, heard the whispers. That's the one, they'd say. Her husband ran off with her mom. Some people were kind, offering pitying looks and awkward words of encouragement. Others avoided me altogether, as if betrayal were contagious. A few even had the audacity to take Diane's side. She's been through a lot, one of her friends told me at the coffee shop. Losing her husband, the divorce, maybe you should try to forgive her. I almost laughed in her face. Forgive her? For sleeping with my husband? For tearing my life apart? I didn't think so. Even Lisa, my rock through all of this, struggled to find the right words. I don't know how you're holding it together, she said one night as we drank wine in her tiny apartment. If it were me, I'd be in jail for murder. You think I haven't thought about it? I joked, though the bitterness in my tone made it clear there was a kernel of truth. Have you talked to her? Lisa asked cautiously. Diane's? I shook my head. What's left to say? She's made her choice. And Daniel? I stared at my glass. I can't even think about him without wanting to throw up. He's just nothing to me now.
But it wasn't that simple.
Diane didn't stop trying to reach me. She sent texts, left voicemails, even showed up at Lisa's apartment once, begging to talk to me. "Jessica, please," she said, her voice trembling as Lisa blocked the door. "I just want to explain. I miss you." I stayed in the kitchen, refusing to face her. "You should have thought about that before you destroyed my life," I called out. "I didn't mean to." "Go home, Diane," I interrupted, my voice cold. "Or wherever it is you live now." As the weeks turned into months, the pain began to dull, though it never fully went away. I started therapy, desperate to make sense of everything that had happened. My therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra, was the first person who didn't sugarcoat things. "Sometimes," she said during one session, "people betray us not because we've done anything wrong, but because they're broken in ways we can't fix. Your mother and your husband aren't your failures. They're theirs." I clung to those words like a lifeline. Eventually, I moved out of Lisa's apartment and into a small place of my own. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a temperamental radiator, but it was mine. For the first time in months, I felt like I was starting to reclaim my life. Diane and Daniel were still together, or so I heard through the grapevine. I stopped caring. I couldn't control what they did or how the world saw them. All I could do was focus on myself. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was more like a twisted, overgrown path, full of detours and setbacks. Some days, I felt like I could breathe again, like I could envision a life where their betrayal didn't define me. Other days, I woke up with anger pounding in my chest, a reminder of the hole Diane and Daniel had carved into my heart. But slowly, I began to put the pieces of myself back together. The first step was setting boundaries. Diane's relentless attempts to reach out didn't stop. She sent flowers on my birthday, a card stuffed with a handwritten note about how much she loved me and how sorry she was. It went straight into the trash. Daniel's attempts were less frequent, but equally pathetic. One night, months after I'd left, he sent me a long email.
"Jess,
I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I just want to say how deeply sorry I am. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I was stupid and selfish, and I let my feelings cloud my judgment. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll understand how much you meant to me, and still mean to me. Daniel." I stared at the screen for a long time, wondering if I should reply. Finally, I hit delete. I focused on rebuilding my life, piece by piece. Therapy became my lifeline, a place where I could process the chaos and begin to let go of the blame I'd been carrying. Sandra, my therapist, was blunt but compassionate. "It's not about forgiving them," she told me during one session. "It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what they did. You don't have to let them back in your life, but you also don't have to let them control it anymore." Those words stayed with me. I started saying yes to things I'd avoided for months. Dinner with friends, office happy hours, even a pottery class that Lisa dragged me to one weekend. "Look at you," Lisa teased as I struggled to shape the wet clay into something resembling a bowl. "A modern-day artist." "It looks like a dog chewed it," I muttered, but I couldn't help smiling. "You're doing it, though," she said, her voice softening. "You're living again." She was right. For the first time in a long time, I was starting to feel like myself again. Or maybe someone new. Someone stronger. The biggest leap came 6 months after I left Daniel. I applied for a promotion at work, a job that would require me to relocate to Seattle. I wasn't sure I'd get it, but to my surprise, I did. "Fresh start," Lisa said when I told her the news. "You deserve it." I sold the house Daniel and I had bought together, signing the papers without a second thought. I didn't care where he lived now or whether Diane had moved in with him. That chapter of my life was closed. Moving to Seattle was terrifying and exhilarating. The city felt alive, a stark contrast to the small-town bubble I'd grown used to. My new apartment was tiny but charming, with a view of the water that made me feel like I could breathe again. For the first time in months, I felt like I had control over my life. One rainy afternoon, as I sat in a cafe sipping coffee, a man approached my table. He looked about my age, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. Hi, he said, holding up his cup. Do you mind if I sit here? The place is packed. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded.
Sure.
We talked for hours about books, travel, and our mutual love for bad 80s movies. His name was Chris, and there was something easy about him, something that made me forget, even for a little while, about everything I'd been through. When he asked for my number as we left the cafe, I gave it to him without overthinking. I don't know where things with Chris will go, but for the first time in a long time, I'm open to the possibility of happiness again. Diane and Daniel are still part of my past, but that's all they'll ever be now. I've blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, and wiped them from my life as much as I can. I've come to terms with the fact that I'll never understand why they did what they did. And I'm okay with that, because this story isn't about them anymore. It's about me.